Research and development was full of civilian would-be con-types who made a living dreaming up Buck Rogers wonder gear for which no scenario existed to justify its use, or Buck Rogers scenarios to give themselves something to design wonder gear for. R&D was so remote from the user level that it was almost as if the soldier in the field was considered a pesky, somewhat irrelevant nuisance who, as much as possible, must not be allowed to interfere with the grand plan. It doesn't take a year-long study to determine the grenade launcher attached to the M16 as an unsuccessful gimmick, wrote Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sunell in the same 16-officer study of problems facing the Army that I participated in. Yet we all went through the agony of installing it. I often wonder who is dictating what to whom, the Army to industry or the reverse order. In the same study, Major Frederick Brown, a tanker like Sunell, wrote of mine detectors in the world of R&D with the same passion I had for a simple grenade pouch. We seemed overly taken with exotic gadgets, while my reaction is certainly emotional. It seems to me if we can go to the moon, we can develop a lightweight, effective density mine detector. Brown also wrote of the over-sophistication of equipment in terms that would become familiar in the years that followed, as the American people got less and less bang, while US defense contractors got more and more bucks. I have a feeling that everybody has written down everything that he believes a piece of equipment should be able to do, then all requirements are totaled. The result is a very expensive, highly complex, long lead time weapon system, which the average soldier has great difficulty in mastering. The military-industrial complex was alive and kicking and growing stronger by the day. Industry was dictating to the Army, but more than ever, that industry was composed of ex-military men who one would have thought would know better, or at least care more about the service they had left behind. As of March 19, 1969, 272 officers of the rank of colonel or navy captain and above were working for the 95 top military contractors, a number that had nearly trebled in the 10 years since Senator Paul Douglas's study identified 721 retired military officers working in the top 88 defense industries. In May '68, Slam Marshall rang me to ask if I'd go back with him to Vietnam. Westy wanted him to have another look at the war. I impulsively said yes, but as we talked, I realized the purpose of the trip was actually to whitewash the effects of the Tet Offensive through Slam's considerable media power. One of the reasons I jumped at the invitation in the first place was that I'd had it with running around the US selling the war on those speaking tours, and I'd be damned if I was going to go back to Vietnam only to continue the charade. So I told him I'd have to think about it, and then that I'd changed my mind. Slam was shocked. He wouldn't take no for an answer, and I finally had to arrange with my new boss, Colonel Kenneth Boulay, to take a short leave just to get away from the constantly ringing phone. I went to Tim Grattan in Seattle, but even there, Slam or his wife Kate called every day, urgently looking for me. Darlene or Tim would always say I was out fishing until the marshals finally got the message. But I did know I was damn relieved when the phone fell silent. I did not mourn the lost opportunity to go back to Vietnam, because I knew it was just a matter of time until I went in anyway. The previous December, Major General Julian Oulé, an old 101 man from Bonia, one of the many slams said he made with his book Night Drop, had been assigned command of the 9th Division by his fellow all-the-way airborne club member William Childs Westmoreland. Oul had asked Hank Emerson to be one of his 3 brigade commanders, and in turn Emerson had suggested to Ewell that I be brought on as one of Hank's battalion COs. Oul had agreed, and naturally so had I. But I'd needed General Z's approval as well, as I was nowhere near the end of my DIT tour, and Zass had invested enough time in me to give him every reason not to let me go. Both Oul and Emerson came along when I went to plead my case. Thankfully, General Zass was completely understanding, putting the interests of the troops above those of the bureaucracy of which he was a part. A rare instance at the Pentagon, I thought. He told me on the spot, in front of Oula and Emerson, that I could go. I was fully appreciative of the sacrifice Zass was willing to make on my behalf. I was walking on air, and even the response of my career branch to the news. You don't want to go back. You've commanded your battalion there. If you go back and get into a Donnybrook, you'll ruin your chances for a star. What you need is joint staff duty. Couldn't dampen my excitement about going back to the cutting edge. The career managers, those #1 string pullers when it came to directing your life, had no appreciation of the individual as they worked out the same equation again and again to prepare everyone to be a future chief of staff. Their pat response to my own news was the final straw for me. I said to myself, screw their advice, and paid no attention to them ever again. Months passed. Ool went over to Vietnam, Hank went over, and then so did Slam Marshall. Then, when I was just beginning to think about putting my house on the market, guess what, Patty? I'm going back to Vietnam, so I'll see you around. General Z called me to his office. Hack, goddamn, would you believe this? Westy just called. He's giving me the 101st. The prize in the army was to command the 101st Airborne Division, and there Zass had been worrying whether he'd get a division at all. So now we've got to get the team together, he continued. You're going to be my G3. It was probably the most important lieutenant colonel spot in a division. I'm not going to be your G3, General Zass, I said. I've got a battalion in the Zeroth. Remember you told General Ewell in this very office you'd let me go. Damn Ewell, Zass exploded. He's got his fair share of studs. I'm going to get some studs too. You gave him your word, sir. I've changed my mind. The situation's different now. Uli's got the best guys there are. He's practically cleaned out the whole army, which he had. I came to rigid attention. Fine, sir, I said. You don't have to stand at attention. Come on, let's start lining up the team. I'm not going, sir, I said. Why not? Because I'm quitting, General Zass. If there's no trust in the army, if you can't trust a general to keep his word after he's given it to you, and after he's given it to another general as you did, General Zass, to General Ewell right here in this office, then I'm checking out of the net. It's all over. Oh, Hack, forget it, Zass said. No way, sir, I replied, and meant it from the bottom of my heart. I put in the paperwork. I had more than 20 years in, and after all, had it not been for Vietnam, I'd intended to get out in '68 anyway. But I didn't want to get out. After months and months of ruminating on the issue, at the 11th hour I knew it was true. I was fed up with the system and the war, but I still loved the army. Besides, I didn't know what the hell I'd do in civilian life. I'd quit on impulse, I had no training, I had no prospects. It was 1953 all over again, and for the first time in a long time I was damn scared. And then Slam called. Just back from Vietnam, he'd heard through the grapevine that I was getting out, and he wanted to know what I was going to do. The $1,000,000 question. I don't know, I said. Well, come work for me, he offered. I'm getting old and tired of all this war and travelling. You can write, you know my style and technique, and you'd be the ideal person in the army to replace me. It was an incredible offer, and I was touched, or saddened, or something. My ambivalence was almost painful about this man who cared for me as he might a son, and would have been truly proud to have me carry on his work. And Marshall was right. Working for him would be the perfect job for me, and once established in my own right, I wouldn't have to wear the same mantle I saw Slam wearing all too comfortably now, that of the Army's top apologist. But then again, too much water had gone under the bridge with Slam. We stood so far on opposite sides of the fence that I knew it would not take long before we found no common ground at all, so I had to tell him no. I never saw or spoke with him again. Just days before I was to be discharged, Swede Larson, at this point CG of 6th Army, called me from his headquarters in San Francisco. He'd heard I was quitting and urged me to change my mind. You're a good soldier, and we need good soldiers, he said. The die's been cast, sir. You've still got the suit on, haven't you? He asked. What would you want to do if you stayed in? General Larson, all I want to do is command a battalion. All right, the general replied. Then why don't you come out here? I'll give you a battalion at Fort Lewis. I could do that. Larson's offer was a reprieve. I still intended to get out, but at least at Fort Lewis I had Tim Grattan nearby with whom I could plan my civilian life. The boys at the Pentagon smirked and sneered. Compared to Da Nang or a combat assignment, a training battalion at Fort Lewis wasn't exactly upmarket. There were no TOE infantry battalions at Fort Lewis. Instead, they were all training battalions composed of troops going through basic combat training or advanced individual training en route to Vietnam. "You won't be doing your career any good," they said. "It's a retrograde step." Little did they know that I was having the last laugh because I didn't care. I read in the Army Times that First Sergeant Sylvester Wilson had been killed in Vietnam. A million years before, when we were both kids, Wilson had been my trusted scout, my navigator who always kept me going in the right direction. I hadn't seen him in all the years since, but his death was that of a brother, and the pain of loss cut deep. Then, on the 4th of July, Fred Terry, on his third tour of Vietnam, died in a mid-air chopper crash during an ISD combat operation. Tears streamed down my face in my Pentagon office as an unknown officer's voice formally asked me over the phone if, at the request of Fred's widow, Carol, I would deliver the eulogy at his funeral. I couldn't. Fred and I had met in battle in my S3 office at Fort Campbell, resulting in a true and lasting friendship. He, like my friend Sylvester Wilson, had died a senseless death in a senseless war, and I knew I'd never find words to describe any of it. On my last day at the Pentagon, Major General William Henderson, the Australian military attaché whom I'd met through his interest in the Vietnam primer, invited me to a farewell lunch. The last time we'd gotten together was in April at his home on the west bank of the Potomac, where we'd sipped cocktails and watched Washington burn as the death of Martin Luther King set off riots unlike the city had ever known. It had felt strange to be with a non-American, much less a British subject, watching our capital in flames. The last time Washington had burned had been by a British torch in the War of 1812. Try to explain it all. Anyway, Henderson wanted to have lunch, and just before I went to meet him, I stopped in to see Colonel Boole. After a boss like Hank Emerson, Boole had been pretty much a non-event, but we'd always gotten along fine and had never had any big shootouts in the 7 months I worked for him. Now, when he showed me the efficiency report he'd rendered on me, which was customary, and congratulated me on my well-earned max scores, the atmosphere was nothing but congenial. I told him the only thing I had on my agenda that afternoon was to be the backup briefer for General Pearson at his 15:30 briefing for the Chief of Staff. It was just my good luck that Pearson had replaced Zass when the latter went off to the 101st, and I had a lunch appointment now. If he had no objections, I'd be off. He didn't, and I went. I met General Henderson at the Australian Embassy. We each had a stiff scotch in his office, and then went to lunch at a place called the Black Beret. We ate and drank some more. In the drinking department, Henderson was a typical Aussie, and I had to make a point of not even trying to keep up with him if I intended to get back to work standing upright. As time slipped by, the hour approached for me to leave. It became harder and harder to break off. I explained to General Henderson that I had to get back for the briefing, but he wouldn't hear of it. "No worries," he said. "I'll just call Westy and tell him you're with me." That may have been the Australian way of doing things, but I rather doubted it would go over too well with the Chief of Staff. "No, sir," I said. "Thanks, but no, don't do that. I've got to be there. I really need to get a taxi." I finally broke away, but the little bit of extra effort cost me time I couldn't afford. I jumped into a cab, zipped back to the Pentagon, ran up the steps and into my office to get the briefing paper I'd need if called upon by Pearson to elaborate for the chief. But the paper was gone. Someone said Jerry Milne had taken it. Pearson had come in looking for me, and when I wasn't there, Jerry, my artillery and air defence action officer and principal assistant due to his overall brilliance and essential qualities, had said he'd stand in at the briefing. At least I knew Pearson was in good hands. I went next door to Colonel Buell's office to find him in a quiet rage. "I guess I screwed up, sir," I said. "I guess you have," Buell responded tersely, without looking at me. "I'll just shoot up to the chief's office and see if there's any flack." "No, you won't, Colonel. Major Milne has taken care of your duties since you weren't here to acquit them." Yes, sir, I'm very sorry. I should have gotten away earlier. I didn't, and I'm fully responsible. Indeed you are. I did feel bad about what had happened. I'd let Pearson down, but there was nothing I could do about it now. As I left Boule's office, his secretary stopped me. "Boule changed your report," she whispered. "Why?" I asked. "Something to do with your not being on the mark with this briefing?" I turned around and went back into Boule's office. "Colonel Boule," I said, "I'm glad we were able to get this situation squared away, and I really am sorry if I caused you any concern on my last day here. But I did want to thank you again for giving me that great report, and I was just wondering if I could have another look at it." Boule got all flushed. "Well, he said. "Well, I have seen it, you know. You showed it to me yourself this morning." Very reluctantly, Boule handed over the efficiency report. In a glance, my blood began to boil. In the revised edition, he'd cut me on judgment. "Wait a minute, sir," I said, as innocently as I could sound with boiling blood. "There seems to be a mistake here. This one has been changed to a 2. Well, you did screw up. Oh, I see. I worked for you for 209 full days, and for one mistake I made today, you decide to give me a 2 in judgment. Well, if you're going to do that, why don't you just change the whole goddamn thing? Colonel Boule, you have attacked me on my most vulnerable point. What I'm all about, and what any good army officer is all about, is judgment. And if I don't have good judgment, I shouldn't be wearing this suit." "I think you're overreacting, Colonel." "Well, I don't give a damn what you think." At that point, a buzzer sounded on Boule's desk. It was General Pearson wondering whether I'd come in yet. When Boule said I was right there, the general asked him to bring me over. He'd organised a little farewell party for me. Given the Puritan that he was, a party with Pearson would be about 6 minutes, a cup of coffee, a medal, and a handshake. Leaders. I was a new recruit, freshly assigned to their unit. I made my way through each block of training, experiencing the system from the ground up and ensuring that the quality of instruction was as high as it should be. As a result of this covert operation, I discovered several issues. The training was, in many cases, not as effective as it needed to be. There were discrepancies between what was intended and what was actually delivered. The recruits were often left to their own devices after being handed off to various instructors, and there was a lack of oversight on the effectiveness of the training they received. My infiltration provided invaluable insights, but it also exposed systemic problems within the training centre. I realised that the Army's commitment to preparing soldiers for combat was being undermined by administrative shortcomings and a lack of genuine engagement from the cadre. This was not just a problem at Fort Lewis, but indicative of broader issues within the Army's training infrastructure. Despite these challenges, I was determined to make the most of my time at Fort Lewis. My goal was to ensure that every soldier under my command received the best training possible, even if it meant confronting and addressing uncomfortable truths. The bureaucratic and petty politics that had marked my Pentagon experience seemed distant now, replaced by the practical realities of preparing soldiers for the rigours of Vietnam. In the end, my time at Fort Lewis was marked by a commitment to improving the training process and making a tangible difference in the lives of the soldiers I worked with. It was far from glamorous, but it was fulfilling in a way that transcended the superficial measures of success that so often dominated military career assessments. I joined, noting that I was a recycle from another company who'd missed this particular block of instruction. Despite being about 1,000,000 years older than the trainees, none questioned this. The only guy who took any special interest in me was a regular Army drill sergeant. During the very last block of instruction, as the company was boarding trucks for the field, he came up to me with suspicious eyes. "Take off your helmet," he snapped. After I'd complied, he bobbed and weaved, crouching like a middleweight as he examined my white Wolves haircut and dog tags, which I had borrowed from Fort Lewis Tom Martin, otherwise known as Private Robert Sena. Sena stayed in the office, keeping me from drowning in paperwork while I played trainee. I checked Sena's name against the company roster. "A trainee, trooper?" the sergeant finally asked. "Yes, sir," I replied from my position of attention. "Korean retread, sir." "Don't you sir me, man?" the sergeant sang in his wonderful tone. "I'm a sergeant, a regular US Army sergeant, so I guess maybe you are a trainee, but you sure are an old damn trainee." As impossible as it seemed, I didn't get caught throughout the entire masquerade, except for the time when one instructor was so incompetent and the instructions so bad that I blew my cover and took over the class myself to prevent the trainees from losing valuable time and critical information. The experience was mind-boggling and unlike anything I could have imagined. Far from the prying eyes of superiors and non-training committee personnel, the AIT training I witnessed was criminal. Virtually everything these trainees got was wrong in terms of its applicability to the war in Vietnam. Meanwhile, essential things were ignored completely, or given so little attention as to render them meaningless. During the instruction block on the M60 machine gun, for example, I sat dumbstruck alongside a befuddled trainee while a young instructor, who'd never been to Vietnam, covered in exceptional detail the making of range cards and walking the final protective line, both pretty useless in the jungle where dense foliage limited vision to a few feet. When we got to the hands-on part, where the trainees actually fired the M60, I noticed most of them didn't react correctly to a misfire. Later, when I asked about 25 of these soldiers what the first step was in dealing with a misfire, not one of them had any idea. It should have been as second nature as throwing on the brakes to stop a car. The 4-hour block of instruction on the Starlight Scope night vision device was so technical and boring that when it was over, I couldn't remember even 2% of what was covered. Neither could my classmates. The impression the instructor gave was that it was so complicated it was well beyond most of the trainees' grasp. In fact, what the average soldier needed to know to operate this superb battlefield tool was so simple it could have been taught in no more than 30 easy minutes. With mines and booby traps responsible for probably 50% of all US casualties in Vietnam, one would have thought that mines and booby trap training would be a top priority in the Vietnam-oriented AIT. Maybe 30 hours minimum, integrated into every other aspect of the training. On the contrary, exactly 5 hours of the entire 9-week course were devoted to these lethal devices. 4 hours on booby traps, barely scratching the surface for the soldiers who would confront them daily in Vietnam, and 1 hour on mines, with the World War II M21 anti-tank mine as the only focus. It was unbelievable. 3 years after the first US doughboys learned about these devices the hard way, there wasn't even a Vietnam-oriented mines and booby trap training film. There was no decent training aid. Something like what I'd heard the Marine Corps had developed, a device that, when exploded, propelled a red substance that clung to the trainee like blood. As I wrote to General Pearson during this period of total shock, almost every US full colonel in Vietnam had an air-conditioned trailer, but we didn't have a training aid that could save legs and lives. I simply couldn't understand it. Exactly 1 hour of instruction was devoted to the subject of Vietnam, which was not nearly enough to counter the "Why Not Vietnam" message being preached day after day at the anti-war, anti-draft coffee houses springing up near army bases all over the country, including Fort Lewis. It couldn't touch the amount of time the NV's individual training schedule devoted to this vital and basic question. About 0% of its instruction. Our recruits were getting little from their training to change their angry minds about the army, the government, or the war itself. A huge part of the problem, I quickly found, was that the average instructor had an even worse attitude than the trainees. These were not the pink-cheeked second lieutenants who'd never left the States, but the usually drafty buck sergeant trainers who gave most of the classes. They were short-timers fresh out of Vietnam who hadn't wanted to go in the first place and had chips on their shoulders the size of a Soviet RPG-7 rocket launcher. They hated the army, they hated the system. They hadn't been trained properly themselves, but because they'd been in Vietnam for a year, had the CIB, and wore a couple of rows of Been There ribbons, they were considered veterans suited for preparing young tenderfeet for battle. This was a problem firmly rooted in the Pentagon's logic. A guy being inducted into the service was given 8 weeks of basic training, 8 to 12 more weeks of AIT, then a short leave before being jetted over to Vietnam for a year and brought back with 6 months left on his mandatory 2-year hitch. Instead of training these soldiers badly for 20-odd weeks, only to have them return to train others just as badly while marking time as snowbirds, army slang for a temporary assignment until they could get out, why weren't they given 40, even 50 weeks of good training up front, then a year in Vietnam with the last 2 to 4 weeks of their hitch back in the US reserved for deprogramming and getting ready for civilian life? It was an unending mystery to me, which, when I experienced the ramifications of it firsthand, became a very serious concern. The trainees looked at their veteran trainers as freshmen do the senior class. The veteran trainers knew it too, milked their positions for all they were worth. If I saw it once while wearing Bob Cena's soldier suit, I saw it a dozen times. A training NCO might start moments after a couple of members turned the unit over to him and began to walk briskly away. Today we're going to have a 4-hour block of instruction on scouting and patrolling. The basic reference for this is Field Manual 21, 75. If you know this book, it will keep you alive on the battlefield. The trainer's monologue would continue in this vein until he saw the company cadre getting into their vehicle and driving away. Then he would pause, maybe until the vehicle was well down the road, and then, "Okay, guys, light up and relax. We're not going to do much this afternoon. We're just going to shoot the breeze. I'm going to tell you how it really is in the been there, 4th Division. Bad Charles's one mean mother. Hell, he'll tear your heart right out of your chest." For the balance of the class, this idiot would tell hair-raising, super-exaggerated war stories that bore little or no relation to what was happening in Vietnam, or, for that matter, to what could possibly have happened to the storyteller. If a kid was sensitive, and most trainees were, by the end of the session, he was scared to death. If he wasn't sensitive, he was totally bored and switched off. Since in either case nobody was better trained for it, the whole thing was a complete waste of everybody's time. Meanwhile, soldiers just weeks from completing the AIT course were poorly grounded in the basics. As a trainee, I observed one squad in the attack problem in which my fellow participants, all of them in their 6th week of training, did not know how to crawl, hit the ground, spring from the prone, move properly, camouflage, find or use cover, change M16 magazines in the prone, or deal with a weapon jam. 2 weeks later, theoretically having gotten the hang of these basics and everything else, dealing with Vietnam, fighting these same trainees, myself included, loaded onto trucks to begin a 48-hour field training exercise, FTX, designed to simulate a US patrol base in Vietnam and the activities that might take place around it. Theoretically, this would give the trainees, all of them just days from graduation, a short leave, and a jet ride to the sultry tropics of Vietnam, a chance to test their newly acquired skills. But the simulated patrol base was covered in snow, and I wouldn't need anything more forever to understand the complaining about poorly trained replacements I'd heard day after day throughout my tour with SLAM. It was no wonder each major US unit in Vietnam set up its own 1 to 2 week in-country training course, of necessity taking its cadre from among the best in its own line units, even if this further shrank its frontline combat strength and effectiveness. I could not believe what I was seeing and hearing. There was little discipline. The trainees shuffled off the trucks and stood in small, shivering, disorganized mobs. There was no training value with no apparent supervision from above. The decision among the training committee sergeants was that it was too cold to train, so they spent their time telling hairy war stories. Soon fires were roaring, and the trainees were standing around smoking cigarettes and warming themselves. When we did finally move out for some little problem, I found myself mesmerized by the little reflectors, only the size of a quarter, each trainee had attached to the back of his helmet. The history of these reflectors was that once upon a time, on an early, not unusually but very foggy Fort Lewis morning, a car drove into the back of a company that was marching up the road to a training area. A number of trainees were seriously injured, and a new regulation soon came down from on high. Henceforth, all soldiers would wear reflectors on the backs of their helmets at all times. Yet there we were on this FTX, up in the mountains in the middle of nowhere, not a car around for miles, pretending to fight the Viet Cong in the snow, and no one had considered telling the troops those reflectors were both unnecessary and inappropriate on patrol. There was absolutely no attention to detail, and it was the details that kept guys alive. As the training horrors at Lewis unfolded before my eyes, the biggest shock for me was the knowledge that I too had been taken in by the impressive statistics and zero-defect appearance of the place. For a very long time, I'd visited Fort Lewis several times from the Pentagon for the express purpose of checking up on the training. Was it possible that every single time I'd been taken in by a well-rehearsed display of the shiniest pairs of boots on post? If I'd been taken in at Lewis, no doubt I'd been taken in when I'd visited the other Army training centres and service schools around the United States too. I'd read the sanitized, best-foot-forward training reports and somehow believed them, much like the one-year tourists at division and corps level in Vietnam, whom I condemned so strongly for believing the inflated reports they got from the battlefield and passing the good word up the chain of command. After my visits to these centres and schools, again and again, I too had confidently advised my general, the director of training, that things looked good at these establishments, and believed it when in fact things could not have been much worse. Yet recommendations and decisions were made based on these inaccurate, barely reliable reports. Fortunately, I recognized the truth, and from then on it was a different story. The training committee was not in my chain of command, so regardless of what I discovered, I really couldn't touch it. What I could do, though, was use my connections with the men who could. General William Beverly, the CG at Fort Lewis, whom I'd known since he was chief of OPO, General Pearson, who, as director of DIT, had the Army's top job for influencing training, General Sid Barry, now the assistant commandant at Benning, who'd been my boss when I was chief of individual training at the Pentagon, and Colonel Gib Gibson at Connaught. While I kept Pearson, Barry and Gibson informed through the informal Old Buddy network on a general basis, the very minute I finished a block of training, I wrote a critique for Colonel Ponder, who passed it on to General Beverly. Much to Ponder's credit, he wasn't afraid to tell the boss things weren't right, and to General Beverly's credit, he used his position to do something about it. Immediate steps were taken to correct some of the grosser deficiencies my reports uncovered, and I was actually quite pleased with the progress being made until I went through that snowbound graduation FTX. It was only then that the futility of it all struck me. Whatever quick fix or serious, lasting alteration to the training Ponder, Beverly or I could effect at Fort Lewis, we'd never make a dent in what could only be considered a profound lack of concern for the basic requirements and welfare of the fighting man at the highest levels of the Army. If they could sanction training for the tropical jungles of Vietnam in the snow, ideally all the training for Vietnam should have taken place in Hawaii, Panama, or the Philippines, where the Vietnam-bound soldiers could at least clear the difficult acclimatization hurdle. It would have worked well to have each training center geared for a specific region in Vietnam, given that the diversity of battlefields, the highlands, the Delta, First Corps, and around Saigon, made the conflict more like 4 or 5 different wars. Fort Lewis, for example, for 3 out of 4 seasons, greatly resembled the highlands, but to train men there in the winter months was a cruel joke. Yet no Pentagon would dare try to close the place even for those few months. Why? Because Fort Lewis was like any other Army camp on Army real estate in the USA. It provided jobs and income for the civilian constituents of senators and congressmen who were invariably running for re-election. Fort Lewis was big business to Northwest Washington politicians, who demanded it be used in exchange for their nod on continued military appropriations. The pussyfooting new breed of statesman generals didn't have the balls, the moral courage, to stand up and say that some things were more urgent, that it was insane to train jungle fighters in the snow. Instead, it was somehow more acceptable to allow badly prepared willy-lump soldiers to die all over the battlefield and just go on answering the letters from broken-hearted parents asking why. That cascaded down to the desks through the offices of the very politicians whose ambitions partially held the answers. Only now did I realize these parents deserved more, much more in reply than a few pat, randomly chosen paragraphs strung together on a page, or that the real explanation was that, other than criminal negligence, there was no explanation at all. Meanwhile, the training system just kept chugging along, impersonal, inept, and yet terribly efficient. Every 9 weeks, churning out young men with one of 3 frontline infantry MOSs, 11 B, C, or D, stamped on their foreheads and then channeling these kids into a sister machine, the death disposal of Vietnam, which churned out body bags and little white crosses with equal facility. Whatever the job description said, it was beyond my capability as a training battalion commander to keep away from the training of my own battalion, the 3rd Battalion, 3rd Brigade. I was motivated by the challenge. I'd always said if I had 5 green soldiers or 5,000 in 6 weeks, I could make all of them pros. The horror that half these kids could be dead in 3 months if someone didn't teach them how to stay alive was real. If there was one thing I knew, it was how to keep men alive on the battlefield. In the months I was at Fort Lewis, I tried with every fibre of my being to pass that knowledge on. To begin with, though I couldn't change the etched-in-stone Army Training Center training system, at least I could neutralize it. First, I took all real responsibility for the potential combat readiness of my troops out of the hands of the committee, whose centralized system ensured that no one up there was really responsible for anything anyway. I couldn't say, "Hey, what the committee's teaching you is wrong." But by having my company cadres stay with their units all the time, sitting in on the classes rather than going away and reporting back to me the deficiencies of the instruction, it put the pressure on the trainers to start doing their jobs right. Simultaneously, I increased the 33rd's training requirements. Training began at dawn with the men barking the standing orders of Rogers Rangers from memory, the knowledge of which was basic to survival on the guerrilla battlefield, and continued well into the evening and at night, long after the training committee personnel had knocked off and gone home. The battalion trained on Saturdays too, their time too short to be spent shining shoes and readying footlockers for the traditional, though meaningless in Vietnam terms, Saturday morning inspections. I had volunteer training for the gung-ho guys on Sundays, and made recondo training available as well, with the successful graduates receiving the coveted black badge. I wrote a 17-page training memorandum that prioritized the most basic of the basics, all of which the Army subject schedule gave short shrift to: how to whisper, sneeze, cough, or even just walk in the bush day and night. Most country boys learned these things before they were 10, but the army of the day was not composed of country boys. Crawling, cover and concealment, security procedures and weapons maintenance were at the top of the basics list. When they were mastered, they replaced in the men their feeling of floundering with one of real confidence. Other new SOPs included the troops carrying their M16S at all times, loaded with blanks, to get used to living in an armed environment, and the rifles were routinely carried at the ready, even when marching from class to class. For all training outside the classroom or battalion area, the rule was full camouflage, black cork for faces and hands, tree branches, packs and helmets. Fort Lewis had never seen anything like this, and at first the 33rd was held up to a lot of ridicule. But while the system was laughing, my men were thinking Vietnam now, and after all, at this critical time of their lives, what else mattered? The troops responded well to the hard, hands-on, repetitive but still interesting work. They may not have wanted to go to Vietnam, but they sure as hell didn't want to die there, so they even flocked to the off-duty volunteer classes like recondo. Meanwhile, I established the requirement that all officers and NCOs in the battalion read and carry on their person General Bruce Clark's guidelines for the leader and the commander, which, as far as I was concerned, was the finest little handbook on leadership and training ever written. I also adopted as their own philosophy the one that I'd learned from a 5x7 card issued to me in Clark's 7th Army in Germany. An organization does well only those things the boss checks. This constant reminder to the cadre to keep reminding their troops that the more sweat on the training field, the less blood on the battlefield, provided the foundation for a damn good, almost stellar battalion. Another major plank in the 33rd success was that, while all the other training battalions at Fort Lewis and at the rest of the Army training centres were geared for the individual replacement system used in Vietnam to keep units as close to strength as possible. From the very first day, I viewed my battalion as a true regular unit and trained it as such. More than anything, this was an issue of spirit. I had long been an advocate of the unit replacement system, which the Australians used and had proved the worth of brilliantly in both Korea and Vietnam. The unit replacement system entailed troopers living, eating, sweating and training as a team for a solid year before deploying together as a unit to the war zone, complete with the experienced cadre of regulars who'd trained them. This made the unit a family. The men loved one another and looked after one another, and as they took their lumps, they absorbed replacements from within the family as well through their own replacement package, perhaps an extra detachment brought along expressly for that purpose. In the unit replacement system, unit pride and devotion naturally resulted in pride and motivation among the individual soldiers who were part of the team. The resulting spirit was the key to getting things done and never giving in. According to its commander, when Horner's 7th Air Cav hung on against impossible odds during the Battle of Ia Drang, for example, the very thing that saved them was the bond of brotherhood the men shared. "We were victorious," Moore said, a very small band of American soldiers who had trained, lived and partied together for 2 years because we were determined to survive as a unit. We were disciplined as men and as a fighting team, and we knew that second place on that ground meant death for all of us in the battalion. We could not accept that, and we won. As the US war in Vietnam expanded and units like the instant 196th Brigade began to be deployed not on the basis of combat readiness, but on Westmoreland's need for more troops, any emphasis there might have been on a unit orientation quickly changed to an individual one, that is, replacements for units already in the field. By the time I hit Fort Lewis, 3 years into the peace, bodies were everything, and the object of the training had first, here is the formatted version of the latest text, and foremost become to get the new kids, like little plastic replacement parts off the assembly line, and into the action as fast as possible with minimum attrition. In the individual replacement system, the troops' complete bewilderment upon arrival in Vietnam had to be dealt with by complete strangers whose teams they joined, despite having no connection with their new teammates or understanding of the nature of the game being played. At Lewis, I couldn't change the fact that my battalion would be together for only 9 weeks before being cast out individually to units all over Vietnam. But while I had them, I was determined that each 9-week cycle of men would be trained in the spirit of the unit replacement system, with all the pride, stability and values this entailed. Just one step in that direction was to nickname the 33rd the Always Alert Battalion, and implement an airborne all-the-way type drill for greetings between the soldiers and their officers. "Always alert," the battalion trooper would salute, and the battalion officer would respond, "Stay alert and stay alive." "Stay alert and stay alive" became the catchphrase of the unit, with the men shouting it in unison at the beginning and end of every class they participated in. It wasn't anything new, though. To someone who'd never trained troops, the whole drill might have seemed very Boy Scout-like, but it was a gimmick that worked because it was a continuous reminder about how to survive on the battlefield and continually reinforced the Always Alert Battalion's collective identity until its men were a cocky and spirited team. In the middle of my unit's transformation, the Dynamic Infantry Conference, a forum sponsored by the Army's Combat Development Command, took place. There were maybe 200 people in attendance, both military and civilian, and the conference was designed to look at the infantry in terms of both the present and what the future 10 and 20 years down the track might bring. A significant portion of the program entailed the participants being broken down into panels of perhaps 12 men to work through given subjects or problems, with any findings and/or conclusions presented to the whole group at the end of the week's meetings. One panel I was on concerned the force structure of the Army of the future. From the outset of the meeting, the civilians were on the offensive. There was much evidence among them of long study at the Herman Kahn School of Instant Expertise, as they pontificated on the Army's short and long-term organisation and equipment requirements. Because they spoke so glibly and knowingly, few military men objected or even questioned what was being said, the result of their own long-term attendance at the Herman Kahn School of Overdeveloped Civilian Brains. Not so with me, however, or with Bird Colonel, subsequently 2-star Michael J. Healy, whose 173rd Gonzo Battalion trained and deployed as a unit under Healy's command, and was reputed to have been one of the most successful in Vietnam. The two of us got into a very violent argument with a civilian PhD about machine guns, what their purpose should be, how many there should be in a platoon, and so on. The argument began when everyone on the panel, civilian and military alike, started nodding their heads and agreeing with whatever this other civilian said. But the civilian was totally unqualified on the subject. He simply did not know what he was talking about. Healy and I, on the other hand, were more than qualified to talk about machine guns. Between us, we probably had 30 years of infantry command experience on the squad, platoon, and company levels, and we had been handling machine guns since we were little more than kids. Yet even after the civilian admitted knowing very little about his subject at all in answer to our pointed questions, Healy and I were singularly unsuccessful in swaying even our fellow military men to our combat-grounded point of view. To me, it was damn scary and did not bode well for a dynamic infantry future. On the plus side, the Dynamic Infantry Conference gave a lot of people a chance to catch up with old friends. I ran into old buddies there whom I hadn't seen in years. When the conference was over for the day, it was one big party for the rest of the night. At one of the more formal gatherings early in the week, I had a truly great thrill. I walked into a reception room only to hear a delighted, "That man, 20 years ago, woke me out of a sound sleep with a big grin and a .45 caliber pistol pointed in my face." It was Colonel James, the helmet muir from my trust days, now a school department head who had never forgotten my face, or the morning my INR squad plucked him, the aggressor commander, right out of his battalion area in full view of his own troops, and taken him back to our HQ as the prize of the manoeuvre. Back at Fort Lewis, I turned my attention to my instant NCOs, who did not have the luxury I had in Italy of almost 3 years to find my footing as a leader of men. While it would have been unfair to expect the shake and bakes to develop in a few months, the leadership skills old NCOs took years to perfect. The extra support at least got them going in the right direction as individual leaders or out of the program before they got someone killed. I tried to give the instant NCOs as much responsibility and training as possible within the battalion as squad leaders and platoon sergeants. One of the more frequent problems I saw was that of the good guy instant NCOs who were afraid not to be liked by their men. These were the ones who really had to be jumped on before they completely gave up all claim to a leadership role in their units. Often all this required was to explain to them that when they got to Vietnam, they would have a lot more friends in their squad or platoon if they just did their jobs and prevented their ill-prepared and generally poorly led buddies from getting themselves wasted the minute they left the base camp. The fledgling non-coms of the 33rd responded well to the responsibility thrust upon them, and all in all, I wasn't unhappy with the progress they were making. So it wasn't until the morning Captain James Mukoyama, acting battalion commander of the 4th Battalion 3rd Brigade, rang me at my office with a little problem that I realized how far the instant NCOs really were from the real thing. Mukoyama said there had been an incident the night before in which one of my drill sergeants, about 6, 1 inch or 6, 2, wearing a 101st patch on the right, Mukoyama said, had beaten up one of his trainees. It was something you always had to be looking out for, but from the description I knew exactly who the offender was. I was very surprised. Sergeant Martin was a regular Army paratrooper NCO, one of very few at Lewis, from the 101st no less, and a damn good man. After telling Mukoyama to come right over, I sent word I wanted to see Martin pronto. "Sir, you've known me for a long time, and I don't brutalize nobody," the drill sergeant began when he arrived a short while later. "This is what happened. About 2100 hours last night, it was dark, and I was driving home. But then I saw this soldier at the edge of the battalion area, and he was wearing Air Force gloves. Air Force gloves? Hands in your pockets? I had a real thing about soldiers putting their hands in their pockets, and I told all my people if they saw anyone doing it to really smoke their asses, which is exactly what Martin had done. "Hey, trooper, get those hands out of your pockets," he'd said. "If you're that cold, get yourself some proper gloves, but you don't go stumbling around this battalion area wearing Air Force gloves." Unfortunately, the trooper was not too cooperative. In fact, he said, "I ain't in your battalion. I can do whatever I want." Understandably, this got Martin's attention, and he bolted out of his R. "You're talking to a sergeant in the US Army, boy," he said to the trainee. "And you don't talk to me that way, you understand, damn you, US Army sergeant," the kid retorted, which was a serious step too far. Martin grabbed the trooper and dragged him to the trainee company orderly room, where a shake-and-bake NCO was in charge of quarters. Sergeant Martin said to the CQ, "You got a room around here where I can talk to this boy in private?" The CQ pointed to the company commander's office. Martin dragged the kid in there and administered some close and sustained NCO justice. As the story unfolded, I couldn't see what the sergeant had done wrong. It was one of those things where you couldn't have NCOs like Sergeant Keane in Berlin beating on kids trapped in cardboard boxes. But you couldn't have your sergeants without any authority either. The fundamental issue here was discipline, the final word in the life and death business of infantry. In the line of duty, Martin had told the kid to get his hands out of his pockets, and the kid had mouthed off to him. It was a clear breach of discipline. Martin could have turned him over to the CQ and pressed charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, but he chose instead to do it the old army way, which I not only condoned but would have done myself had I been in his shoes. The sergeant's mistake was he hadn't realised he was behaving old army in front of an ultra-new army NCO, a shake-and-bake who hadn't wanted to be in the army in the first place and whose sympathies lay with the kid. So instead of looking the other way as an old army non-com would have, the instant Sergeant CQ wrote in the battalion journal how my man had savagely beaten one of the trainees. Now the kid was pressing charges, and the shake-and-bake was a witness. The only two bright spots in the affair were that both Martin and the trainee were black, which closed the door on charges of racism, and that Mukoyama, who'd been called at home by his duty officer soon after the incident, had gotten in touch with me as soon as I got to work at 0500. As it was, there was still very little time. The problem was that there had been a number of similar incidents around the post lately, and a crackdown had been ordered. If the matter wasn't settled by the time the brigade people arrived for work at 0800, they would undoubtedly want Martin's head. But the army could not afford to lose the few Martins it had left. So if I could just administer some sort of punishment before the brigade staff arrived, the process could be thwarted. To court-martial the man would be double jeopardy. I dismissed the drill sergeant and told him to trust me and stand by. Meanwhile, Mukoyama arrived, and together we devised a scheme to save my man's career. James, the Mu Mukoyama, was a good man. I'd met him months before at Lewis's Training Centre HQ when he was secretary to the General Staff, and for me it had been almost love at first sight. Instinctively he reminded me of Jimmy Mamura from the Raider days so long ago. As time passed, that instinct proved correct. Mu was a first-generation American of Japanese descent whose sense of duty, honour and country, without the benefit of a West Point ring, was that of someone who had not yet taken it all for granted. On top of that, like Jimmy Mamura, Mu was a stud. When we'd met, I couldn't understand why he, a regular army infantry captain, was wasting his time behind a desk in a flunky HQ. I'd immediately offered him a company command in the 33rd, and it was just my bad luck he'd been about to take a similar job in the 4-3 Battalion. Events were proving, however, that may have been all for the best, at least for Sergeant Martin. After rehearsing the plan, Mu and I called in the trainee, the drill sergeant, and the shake-and-bake. The trainee was, in my judgment, nothing more than a weak, whining punk. He was barely banged up, much less savagely beaten. My guess was Martin had bumped him up against the wall a few times and just scared the shit out of him. Mukoyama explained to the trainee that I had reviewed the situation and had decided the trainee was definitely in the right. I was going to invoke a general court-martial against my drill sergeant, if that's what the trainee still wanted. Yes, that's what he wanted. The only problem, Moo went on, was that both the trainee and the shake and bake would have to be confined to Fort Lewis as material witnesses until the court-martial, which could be weeks away given that it was almost Christmas. "You mean I can't go home for Christmas?" asked the trainee. "That's right," said Mukoyama. "But I'm going to need to go home right after my leave," Captain, a worried shake and bake, chimed in. "I've got to see my mother. I've got to see my girl." "My hands are tied," Mukoyama said sorrowfully. "You want justice to be done, don't you?" "Yes," but the trainee whimpered. "Wait a minute," I said on cue. "There is another way I could do this. I could give my man a non-judicial punishment, an Article 15 instead of the court-martial. Could we go home if you gave him that?" asked the trainee. "Yes, you could," I replied. "Of course I couldn't hurt him as much as I'd like to. I could only take one stripe off him, about $500, and restrict him for 30 days, which isn't all that severe." "Oh, I think that's severe enough, sir," the trainee jumped in. "You really think it's adequate?" "Yes, sir," agreed the shake and bake, nodding his head vigorously. "More than adequate, sir." I turned to Martin. "Sergeant, would you accept an Article 15? I assure you you're getting away light." "Yes, sir," he replied. "I will." "Fine," I said. "I'll administer that punishment now." I dismissed the two younger soldiers, who couldn't have been happier to split the scene. When Martin and I were alone and all the paperwork was being typed up, I said to the sergeant, "I'm giving you an Article 15, and I'm fining you $500, but unless there's another incident, you won't be out of cent, and there'll be no black mark on your record because the paperwork will never leave my desk." "Airborne, sir," he said. "But, Sergeant, if you ever have to do that kind of thing again, for Christ's sake, choose your witnesses a little more carefully." By 0800, my desk was clear, with the Article 15 safely filed away. So when Lieutenant Colonel Moody, the by-the-book brigade XO, called precisely at 0800, wanting explanations for the damaging log entry and demanding a court-martial, I was able to say it's been taken care of, sir. I bore his momentary wrath for not consulting him or Colonel Ponder before passing judgment, and then let the whole thing blow over, which it did. I did, however, call the shake and bake into my office to remind him he was now a non-commissioned officer in the U.S. Army. "Stop thinking like a private," I said. "It's a luxury you won't be able to afford on the battlefield when the real privates turn to you to keep them alive." I don't know whether the guy understood, but even if he did, I came out feeling as though I were swimming against the tide. If this kid was the quality on an attitude level alone of the instant NCOs coming through the system, combat forces in Vietnam could well be at best only marginally better for them. And time would prove there were some damn lousy instant NCOs in Vietnam, but there were some damn good ones too. The program wasn't perfect, but it was far better than nothing, and many men did respond to the philosophy at the root of it. Make men believe they are leaders, and they will become leaders. It had worked for me in Korea and F Company 223rd, when Hudson, Smith and Allison grew right into the stripes I'd given them out of desperation and a gutted NCO corps. The big problem that arose with the instant NCOs in Vietnam was that the school system quickly made the measure of the program's success the same measure it used for everything else, a low attrition rate. Real motivation or basic leadership potential, which had been the basis of our success in F Company, became virtually incidental to the output. This bored a huge hole in the whole concept of the program and the reason it had been conceived, but there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. I had no authority to hire or fire, so all I could do was write letters about the problem to my influential friends, give my own men the best I could, and just hope for the best for the rest. That included the kids who didn't want to go. For all my people who went to Vietnam, I was going to be damn sure they got the very best training available in the U.S. Army. But for those who didn't want to, I did what I could to help them stay out. At the beginning of a new training cycle, I had each of my company commanders ask if anyone in his unit was a conscientious objector. There was no point in training these guys in infantry if they could be gotten out early and trained in something else. Besides, many a CO went on to Vietnam to become a brave and competent combat medic, making the infantry's loss now the infantry's gain when it counted. When I interviewed the potential COs, I tried to help them get their story straight. I agree with you that it's a bad war, I'd say, but that doesn't qualify you to be a CO. What religion are you? I don't have a religion. Well, you better get one, I'd counsel, and send him to the local padre or coffee house to make sure he knew the right words. When he came back to see me the next day, I'd pretend I'd never met him. After he said the right words, I'd make my recommendation that he be given CO status. I don't know what my motivation was. 20 years before, even 10 years before, I would have dealt with COs with extreme prejudice. Cowards, every damn one of them, I would have thought. But it was a different world now and a different war. A war that just months earlier I'd sworn I'd take my son to Canada before I'd let him fight in a war without a villain. Nationalists fighting for a better deal were not exactly Hitler or Tojo. So if a guy didn't want to fight, why should he? There were plenty who wanted to or were programmed by fathers or family histories to think they wanted to prove their manhood or as a point of honor and hang the cause. The interesting twist about my conscientious objector policy at Fort Lewis, though, was that with the option available in the 33rd, I actually had fewer guys bucking for CO status than in other battalions in the brigade. In mid-December, I was selected early for the Army War College. I was very proud, first because I was picked up in the very first year of eligibility, my 14th year of regular service, while most guys might wait 6 or 8 more years after that. And second, because despite the fact I'd been told so often by men in the know that I was viewed as a CER and a shoo-in for War College and an early star, I'd learned when I was not selected for Major in Germany never to count on anything. After all, not too many people who start off a buck private in the rear ranks at age 15 make the big league. As I wrote to Ward just with the news, the personnel people were not in the least impressed with the good word. In fact, they were indignant I'd escaped my Pentagon jail term early. I'd purposely, even eagerly, taken the retrograde and disastrous career step of a training battalion at Fort Lewis. I'd ignored the personnel guy's advice entirely, and I'd still made the War College list below the zone. It pissed them off royally and only added to my joy. I took leave over the Christmas holidays and drove the family to LA to spend Christmas with him and his new bride, Helen. With 3 crumb snatchers less than 9 years old cooped up in a station wagon for 3 days, the drive was worse than combat. Fortunately, everyone survived, and there was even time to relax for a few days until just before New Year's 1969, when I received a 0500 call from OPO at the Pentagon. The time of the call was significant. It was 0800 in Washington, D.C., and my caller's lack of respect for the 3-hour time difference to the West Coast was typical of the no-in-can-do attitude that characterized the Army bureaucracy of the day. General UUL wants you to take a battalion in his division, the OPO voice informed me. He's requested you by name. We don't recommend it. You've had 2 battalions. You have nothing to gain, and there's a long line of others who've never had a battalion and are still waiting. You would have to defer War College, and if you go, you'll only get in trouble and ruin your chances for a star. We recommend you stay at Lewis until War College in August. When do I leave? I replied. Patty could have killed me. Even I was surprised at how easily I made the decision, particularly given the intensity of the inner struggle that had been going on since my tour with Slam, which had me always wanting to go back to the fray, even as all I wanted to do was quit and disappear before the anger over the senselessness of it all blew up inside me. When I'd read USMC Lieutenant Colonel William Corson's The Betrayal, recently published about the folly of the US pacification effort in Vietnam, I'd recognized that as another drop of water on the rock after Doc Benjamin after war, just toward a truer way of seeing. For the first time, I had begun to see myself very comfortably removed from both the conflict and the inept managers responsible for it. Meanwhile, in the personal realm, I was very happy at Fort Lewis. I wasn't bored, Patty and I got along fine, and I enjoyed being with the kids. We had beautiful quarters, a big, modern, Western-style four-bedroom house in a well-forested, secluded part of the post. Tim Grattan, my closest friend, lived in Bellevue, where he was already making big bucks in land development. We got together frequently, and really, until the moment the opportunity came to go back to Vietnam, at least a part of me had planned to give even War College a miss, retire right there and go to work with Tim. But the opportunity did arise, and though I knew the war was a totally senseless exercise, I took it. It was almost as if the decision had been made for me. When I wrote to Ward just to tell him of my change of plans, I tried to explain, despite my close and sustained criticism of it all, why. "I am a professional," I wrote. "A pro doesn't sit on the bench simply because he has played out his quota of time. He wants to get in there, mix it up, and contribute towards moving the ball toward his goal line, regardless of what the chances of winning are. I know my job through my skill developed through long experience and hard study. I can get the job done at the least possible cost to the young citizen soldiers who make up the thin red line. I have many tactical ideas and theories concerning how to fight the guerrilla, which I have been mulling over since my last tour. I would like to prove to the traditionalists that there is another way to fight the G rather than high did right down the middle. If I am overwhelmingly successful, I might possibly influence the proponents of the unsuccessful search and destroy operations. At least my credentials will back up my arguments a little better. I cannot think of a profession that is more demanding, deadly, and where the responsibility is more awesome. As you well know, mistakes that are made on the battlefield cannot be covered up. They always clearly show themselves on the casualty lists. Thus, I think that our units in Vietnam should have the finest leaders possible at the expense of these leaders who are regulars, and God damn it, should be prepared to pay the price. Personal discomforts, family and career development, such as attending War College. Christ, we didn't send commanders home during World War II for schooling. Why Vietnam? Why indeed? Over the next 2 weeks, while good soldier Patty got the house and the family squared away for the 12th move in 11 years, I got on the phone to begin assembling my team. The word was the battalion I was about to take over was very sick. I figured if I had about 10 good studs, we could easily knock it into shape. It really was my dream to mould a combat battalion into a perfect fighting force. I can always go to War College, but I cannot always fight a battalion. As I wrote in less than lofty terms to ex-327 Tiger Major Nev Bumstead, who'd become a good friend, whose judgment and attention to detail I respected, and whom I wanted for my S3, my only regret was that Hank Emerson would not be my brigade commander. He was actually out of the 9th Division entirely, having been shot down in a chopper in September and evacuated back to the States with severe burns. Still, I knew I'd have no trouble from above, because Hank was one of General Uhl's boys, and I was one of Hank's. General Uhl, who'd asked for me by name as per Hank's recommendation, would respect me as per aim to get the job done. That was the way it worked. As the reality of my imminent return to Vietnam sank in, I couldn't wait to get back in the game. I'd been at Lewis for 4.5 months, able to put my mark on just 2 full cycles of AIT trainees. It was but a tiny drop in a huge ocean, even though I did get very real satisfaction from the cheery, always alert, snappy salutes I received from occasional 33rd graduates who recognized or served under me in subsequent years in Vietnam. In the end, my only lasting contribution to the AIT program was in thwarting the Army bureaucracy in one tiny way. When one of my cycles somehow finished a few days early, but because of some Army regulation, the soldiers weren't allowed to leave Fort Lewis until the originally scheduled date, it was crazy to expect 1,000 men on their way to Vietnam to sit on their asses at Fort Lewis for 2 or 3 days doing nothing when they could be home with their families or their girlfriends. So I raised hell, yelled and screamed all the way up to General Beverly to let them go. But regs were regs, and no one would budge. Fortunately, by now I knew how to manipulate the system on almost every level, and I had contacts everywhere. In this case, I called General Pearson at the Pentagon, and before the day was out, he'd sent a cable to Lewis stating that not only were these men to be allowed to go home immediately, but that the same would apply in any cases like this at any of the other training centers. It was a small victory. I left Fort Lewis wondering if it would have been better if I'd gone there before my Pentagon stint rather than after. While the Pentagon statistics and all outward appearances pointed to max efficiency, my eye had now told me the training system was in shambles. The curriculum was myopic and rigid, a million unbridgeable miles from the present battlefield. When there should have been a direct line, by the time the product of these training centres was tested and proved deficient, it was too late to make adjustments or corrections. Had I known this at the Pentagon, I might have made a project of getting every US Army training centre to have a stud who really understood the war as a liaison on the ground in Vietnam. These guys' entire jobs would be to bop around the country looking at the units and looking at the war. They'd check in with graduates of their particular training centres, find out how they were, and what training areas the now battle-wise soldiers believed needed expanding. Then the liaisons would report their findings back to their training centres, along with their thoughts on the direction the training should be going. Had I known at the Pentagon the terrible plight of trainees under the tutelage of short-timer snowbird instructors, I might have pushed to have the training schedule lengthened up front to eliminate the short-timers entirely, and in the process double, at the very least, the training value for everybody. And why were Passover washed-out officers vegetating and waiting for their final parades? In one of the most important jobs in the US Army, training centres and Army service schools should have been manned by the Steve Peenas and the Glover Johnses. Why not Peenas and Johns themselves? Had I still been at the Pentagon, I might have pushed to have these warriors and others like them recalled from retirement. We were in a war. We didn't need any more dancing, prancing chief of staff material, complete with master's degrees from Harvard. We needed experienced men who could train soldiers for combat. These men wouldn't leave the United States. They'd just make sure the ones who did came back as now retired Colonel Johns wrote to me on the subject. We now are thrown out on our ass at 55 if we have not been touched by the magic finger of fate and come up with a star, regardless of how good we might be at something. Do you think that maybe I, without my star, could not have done a better job of teaching tactics at Benning than a lot of the young kids who were sent to Vietnam for a few months to see how it was? Free to move around and go and do what I wanted, like go on a patrol or BS with the GIs. Yes, JNS could have, and for the sake of the students, he should have been given the chance. I feel strongly, he continued, that the more efficient and experienced older officers, even if they know they will not be promoted, should at least be given the opportunity to stay on in the capacity of a permanent instructor, complete with refresher courses in the field themselves. There are so many jobs that young officers on the way up neither want nor need that could be filled by older officers. The Army would do well to seek a special category for such officers that would in no way interfere with the rapid promotion of the others, and at the same time keep happy and healthy and useful a lot of men who had devoted their lives to their country, knew no other bag, and could do a magnificent job for their country. Still, it was a solution that could have worked if someone had been in the right place at the right time with enough gelite to upend Mount Everest. But no one was moving mountains, and having done my time in the Pentagon, where, far from the cutting edge, it was so easy to be fooled by the completely institutionalized appearance of total perfection, and then down on the ground level at Fort Lewis, where attention to detail was virtually a mortal sin, I doubted such a sensible idea was even broached without dismantling the Army's training apparatus and starting from scratch. But since that wasn't going to happen either, it seemed as if the machine would just keep on cranking out young men who were not prepared for the ordeal ahead, who would survive if they survived by hook or by crook, but with little thanks to the US Army. It was no way to run a war.